I can tell this is going to be a great panel because they can't stop them from talking, even when they're not on the stage. So we kind of like, as I say, it's kind of almost obligatory at the moment to have a panel which tackles the question of AI and the 2024 election. We've got a great group to tackle this. We have a great moderator in my new colleague, Sewell Chan, who is the executive editor of the Columbia Journalism Review as of a couple of months ago, but actually in the building as of last week. So welcome to our air conditioning systems. Before that, for those of you who don't know, Sewell led the Texas Tribune as the editor-in-chief, where he won the National Magazine Award for Non-Profit Newsroom and the Collier Prize for State Government Accountability. We also have with us Julia Angwin, long-time expert in many of the things that we have been talking about, Pulitzer winner and former Wall Street Journal journalist, founder of The Markup, now running yet another fantastic newsroom called Proof News, which has actually been doing some genuine testing of a lot of the AI systems in terms of their integrity around protecting elections. Neil Chase, who is Chief Executive Officer of CalMatters, formerly Executive Editor of the Mercury News and the East Bay Times, and he's worked as a journalist for the San Francisco Examiner, the Arizona Republic, CBS Market Watch, and the New York Times. And last but not least, Ben Smith, Editor-in-Chief of Semafor, who spent more than a decade reporting on politics, including at Politico, the New York Daily News. He was the media columnist at the New York Times, founding Editor-in-Chief of BuzzFeed News. And I have to tell you, when your phone goes off and you get a question, I see Ben's name, I'm like, oh, he's got a story, and maybe he's just accused me of being a terrible source because I refused to tell him a story. But that's but that's what a good reporter he is. Exactly. So I'd like to welcome Sewell and the panel to the stage. Come on up.
Hello, everyone. We are the last panel of the day, so we have a high bar to clear, and we're going to clear it. So I'm just going to project the confidence there.
In terms of not running long?
Yeah, that too. And I hope you'll have a vigorous set of questions. So I'll start with a few. I'm going to before we're going to discuss the legislation and the regulation in a moment, but this has already been quite a campaign cycle. We've had fake videos, fake robocalls. Yesterday, the federal government director of national intelligence warned about the influence of Russia, Iran, and China in producing election-related misinformation. And the intelligence agencies described AI as not yet revolutionizing, but accelerating and improving on the kind of various propaganda-related skills of these foreign actors. So we're going to start with a very broad question. Are we too scared right now? Scared enough? Or not scared enough?
I mean, I think the thing that scares me is I don't know. Like, my impulse is we're too scared, honestly, that like the weird stuff that's happening in the election in reality is pretty weird, and that there hasn't, and that, but I think that and this is in some ways a meta point as well, like the core threat of AI, at least in its current iteration, is the sort of liar's dividend, where it's not so much that you're tricked by the Balenciaga Pope, but that when somebody denies something real, they can get away with it, that there's this sort of miasma of doubt around the election. But I also find that in covering it, I am sort of like, because the platforms have grown so opaque, the ecosystem is so fragmented, that I realize like I don't really know what's going on as a reporter in the way that in the bad old days of these wide open, insane platforms of Facebook and Twitter, there was terrible things happening, but you didn't know what was going on. I was on TikTok yesterday and I got a video that was like, you may have seen this story about China, but like, let me tell you what's really going on. I got out of this cult called Falun Gong, and I'm going to expose to you that they're a cult. Could be a totally authentic thing. It was kind of an interesting video. Could be being pushed by the Chinese on platform. There is no way to get an honest answer to that question. Julia.
I want to kind of flip that question around a little bit, which is that, the national security state loves to make us afraid. That's their job, and then it justifies their salaries. But I think they're really important, and that's not to say that there aren't real threats in the world, but I actually think the thing that is the most scary about that situation we're in is that the national security establishment is not there to defend us. Do you know what I mean? They're basically, the people who are supposed to defend us are these corporations with profit motives and who don't really have any allegiance to us, the users and consumers of their content. And there are no laws telling them what they can and can't do. And so the only line of defense. So the thing is, it's not so much whether there's a threat, but who's defending us against this threat? And right now, it's kind of like a bunch of dudes who are really trying to make a return on their billions and billions of dollars of investment, and that's their main thing that they need to do. And so putting curbs and limits on content that's dangerous or harmful is not on their priority list.
Which is fascinating because it makes you think about if you're a consumer, then who do you think is protecting you? And the answer is nobody, right? Which puts it back on everybody individually to have to go out there and police the stuff themselves and make decisions themselves, which I guess was always true to an extent. But to your question about being afraid, I don't think I think we need to be afraid. If you're not afraid, you're not looking, you're not understanding, you're not questioning. But afraid should cause you to question. It shouldn't cause us to shut this down. It shouldn't cause us to stop sharing information. It should make everybody a more vigilant consumer, ideally.
So I'm struck that I feel usually the public, lags behind the level of fear, but we have more than 3/4 of Americans saying in polling that they are actively worried about AI's role in the election, and I'm wondering, does that make this distinctive in that the level of awareness of AI and frankly mistrust of it, without fully understanding it, but that seems to be it seems that the public has caught on to the potential.
Honestly, I think that's marketing. I think the AI industry has managed to persuade people it's super important and scary. If you ask people in polls what their
Pew Research Center.
Yeah, but if you look at the numbers about what are their priorities, AI doesn't rate. Right. So I think there's I do think it's had the effect of lowering people's trust in everything, which again, possibly justifiably. I actually think people are much harder to trick than they used to be. They're even harder to trick with things that are true. You know what I mean?
Because they're more suspicious?
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
I mean, in those same polls, that same group of people, 20% of them believe the 2020 election was stolen, right? So
just 20?
Yeah. Or maybe, I don't know, more. I mean, whatever the number is.
It's about 20, yeah.
Yeah. That idea that we are worried about what AI is doing, it ties into everybody else's worry. If you think the 2020 election was stolen, your worry is different than if you think somebody's going to use AI in a malicious way in a campaign, right? I mean, just everybody's scared, but in very different ways.
Well, and the fear seems bipartisan, which is also interesting and kind of unusual. Julia?
I mean, I think that one of the things I think the companies did to themselves was by marketing AI as so good that it's going to kill us all, right? That was their opening bid, right? And so then now they're in this trap. It's not that good, but you got everybody scared, right? And so I do think you're right. It is a little bit of an artifact of the way they went to market with a product that is in no way intelligent. I will concede it's artificial.
Could that have been intentional? I mean, do you start out generating the fear so that then the reality won't be as scary? Would you give them credit for that much?
I have to tell you, it reminds me of MySpace, which I wrote a book about. Okay, it was a social network before Facebook, for those of you who haven't heard of it. But the thing is, MySpace, back in the day, really marketed itself as they wanted to be slightly dangerous because they wanted to be the cool nightclub compared to the Ivy League Facebook. And so it's not like it's an unknown tactic to be the dangerous sort of slightly cool kid. And I think that's what AI was.
I was an earnest Friendster person during during
that
era.
That was a different. Those were the Linux people.
Do we get to talk about AIM now?
Oh my god!
CompuServe?
Oh my god, that was a good one.
Okay, we're gonna not go down Oldster memory lane here. Tell us, okay, but let's look at some of the actual harms, right? I mean, Elon Musk recently tweeted an altered video of Kamala Harris. You know, there were fake robocalls purporting to be President Joe Biden in New Hampshire. You had the RNC release a video last year that kind of, portrays an apocalyptic hellscape that would be unleashed if Biden's reelected. And yet I also read an interesting Republican FEC commissioner recently saying, if the Daisy commercial, and this was the very effective LBJ ad in 1964, showing it wasn't artificially created, but it was obviously not a real life scenario, showing a girl, picking flowers or whatever, and a nuclear cloud mushrooming behind her, warning of the perils of electing the unstable Mary M. Goldwater. And he was saying, would we have tried to prosecute or regulate that today? So it gets into the free speech issues. But I feel the narrative until recently was that AI has not had as big an impact on this election cycle as had been feared. Was that an accurate narrative?
Well, I kind of want to push back on the question a little. You said the word harm. Like, Elon Musk tweets a picture of Kamala Harris dressed as a communist supervising armies of red-coated cadres. That's just politics. I mean, the Daisy ad was politics. A lot of hyperbole, lying, ridiculousness, people are able to understand as politics. And I do think there's something a little patronizing about, calling that a harm. Sorry, I'm distracted. What was the question?
No, that was great. That was great, actually. Yeah, but Julia, what did you in one of our emails you talked about this narrative that this AI hasn't had much of an impact on this election. You seem to be pushing back against that narrative.
Yeah, I think what I've been pushing, I've seen a couple stories that are like, AI it hasn't impacted the election as much as we think, and I think it's because because a lot of the images that have been debunked, right, that we know about, the robocall of Biden's voice was identified, right? So I think what we know is the things that have been debunked. What we don't know is sort of what else has happened. And I think the other thing that I think is very important is that AI doesn't always surface in the same way that people are thinking of it. Which is like, I wasn't talking into it. AI doesn't always surface in the same way that people think it's going to be, as just an image. So, think about the Russian network that was paying all these YouTubers to create videos spewing Russian propaganda. I wouldn't be surprised at all if those guys took all that money and then actually asked ChatGPT to write their script for them, because, who has time to think of Russian conspiracy theories, right? And so, and it's hard to figure out a new thing to say about why, Kamala is a lizard or whatever the hell they were saying. So I think there are all sorts of ways that AI can be superpowering disinformation. Not that it wouldn't have happened, but it does make it cheaper and more effective.
Yeah, just to give the most obvious example, like the way in which TikTok's video editing software, and if you can call it AI, or you can just call it very good editing technology. But if people were watching videos, remixes of Trump talking about cats and dogs and over music or with dogs saying the words and making fun of Donald Trump, in some sense that was all AI-enabled Democratic propaganda. I don't know. That doesn't upset me that much.
I'm just thinking about the tools, right? Or what you said about the Russians. There's now enough training data on Russian propaganda about U.S. elections that AI could generate all those scripts, right? But that disinformation has been working for a long time. We saw a lot of people apparently fooled by disinformation in 2016 and in 2020 and in the years in between. So AI makes it faster and better and easier. And if you're the Russians, your budgets are tight, so cheaper, right? But I don't know that it changes the fundamental need for people to filter disinformation and understand when it is fake.
Well, so let me push back for a moment for argument's sake, and I'm going to stick on the cats and dogs theme. Are we going to look back in this election and say how naive it was for Trump and Vance to have pushed a narrative of a false narrative of Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs, when you could actually produce clear and compelling and crisp, digitally manipulated and generated images purporting to show Haitian people eating cats and dogs?
Oh, you're saying it was a missed opportunity, that they should have made AI images of
I'm being devil's advocate, of
right.
course, but
I mean, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think we're already in a place where...
And not talking about it, but letting it float out there, right?
See, I think we're already in a place where it wouldn't work because people would believe it was fake. And to me, the bigger problem is that is also true of real videos.
So the Access Hollywood tape, the one in which
That's the best example. Just imagine tomorrow there's a tape, and again, it's audio, which is even easier. I mean, really, you can really do good things with audio. And there's a tape of Donald Trump saying something so disgusting that you're even in this case shocked, right? Which is a quite high bar at this point. And it was when he was on the set of a TV show, and there's no video, it's just audio, and he says look, whatever you think of me, I didn't say that. That's a deep fake. You wouldn't know.
So
you would have to really, really understand the chain of custody, which is our job.
Wouldn't it then depend on the source, though?
Yeah, it would depend on the journalist.
Which
to
I think
really
is
nail
actually
down
the silver lining for us,
Totally.
right? If you can't trust anything you see or hear anymore, then you got to go to what's the source you got it from. And if the source is a news organization you trust, or a person you trust, or something, or a, whatever, a YouTuber you trust, is that going to be the thing we use to determine whether content is fake or not if we can't actually tell if it's fake?
But how are we going to tell, right? Because, especially with audio, it's actually...
Because you know who you got it from, and you know where they got it, and they have to show you how they pulled it out of the machine.
So there's an interesting example, right? For a couple of years ago in Los Angeles, the LA Times ended up, doing some magnificent work here, but someone had posted on a message board, I think it was Reddit, about these Los Angeles politicians talking smack about each other and making really ethnically inappropriate comments. If you haven't read the stories, they're really
incredible stories.
Yeah, they're incredible stories. They're very, very juicy. I happen to know that LA Times was able to authenticate the provenance of the audio. But I'm curious about our decision making as journalistic leaders for a moment. Neil, if someone tomorrow said, if an otherwise reliable source came to you tomorrow but they were a sole source saying, I have audio of Gavin Newsom, saying these outrageous things, is your level of care and your editor's level of care different now than it would have been 4 years ago? Are you kind of extra paranoid about verification?
I would hope the level of care is no different. The technique might be different. The tools you would use might be different. The ways you would try to figure it out might be different. But if we weren't skeptical about that, 4, 8, 12 years ago, we should have been. I think we should have the same level of skepticism we always do. It's just that the list of things that you might question about it would be different as the technology changes, I think.
I do think we're also in an era, I do think things have changed a little bit in the sense that I think journalists are becoming a little wiser to the way that leaks are being weaponized, and we're being used as tools, right? And I think that obviously the Hillary Clinton emails was sort of an example, and the difference in the way the press has handled the Trump leak emails is because we do have to play a role here. And I do think you're right that there's a hope for journalism here, but it's also a sad hope, that we are just unpaid fact checkers for big tech, and so I think or low paid, I guess. But my point is it just is a very different conception of our role, and it's one that I think that the bigger problem that Ben is pointing out is actually that all of this disinformation, whether it's created through automatic means or not, discredits our work, and we have to fight so much harder for authenticity. And I think that is actually probably the biggest impact of AI that is hurting our profession so much.
Yeah, if I can actually, I just want to I think it's such a double-edged sword, because I do think it is we have a job, right? A trusted brand has some more value, but also, is this what we want our job to be? But I think I disagree with Neil. I was a political blogger for years and was probably writing maybe 15 times a day about most leaked audio, mostly leaked emails, but also leaked audio. And I remember when I was working with our mutual friend Mark Schoofs, and whenever he's a great investigative journalist, and whenever he would get a leaked piece of paper, he would have this unbelievably pedantic process that would drive me crazy of making sure it was authentic. And I was like, look, I have probably written about 10,000 leaks in my life, and I've never been exposed to a fake document. I mean, I'm sure they exist, we've all heard of them, but it's so vanishingly unusual that why are we worrying about this?
Because the one that happens that you credit false.
Yeah, but there are other kinds of mistakes
could be career-ending.
There are other kinds of 1 in 10,000 mistakes that you don't devote that kind of energy to, but I just think that has just totally, genuinely changed, and there's fake stuff being shopped to journalists just with regularity now.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. So I want to mention a topic, the topic of fact checking. You know, I think the teens, if we can call them that already, the 20 teens, were kind of the decade of the kind of PolitiFact, you know, Glenn Kessler, you know, everyone was hiring political fact checkers. I still think it's a wonderful thing. It can be. It's challenged right now, but I'm you know, intrigued. The political theorist Danielle Allen recently said, I think in a report that you worked on, Julia, or commented on, that that the production of misinformation vastly outstrips any human capacity for keeping up in terms of fact checking. I think that's true if we're talking about all misinformation. I think even if you're talking about political actors, that may be becoming true. So is the era of fact checking, you know, is that going to seem like a quaint, you know, obsession of ours? Or do you think actually that, you know, fundamental journalistic skill actually is only going to grow in importance?
I think it has to be important because the only thing we stand for as journalists is facts. I think. I mean, that's what I'm in it for. I don't know what everyone else is in it for. But I mean, my feeling is that's what we do, right? And so we must present accurate facts. And I think that, like, whether there's a business model and audience appetite for, like, fact checking specific sites, et cetera, is, I think, a separate question. But, like, veracity of facts and helping the public understand those things is, I think, a core purpose of journalism. And in fact, even more important now. If you don't mind, I'll just do a little bit of a mini rant that I have, which is that I think in our world right now, you know, some of the words we use as journalists, I think, don't make sense. So we talk about stories and narratives and how we really want to make everything a story and a narrative. And the weird thing is that the audience is drowning in stories and narratives. They're actually like, I can't even look at threads. If I have to look at one more person's story of an airline seat missing or whatever, that, like, you know, I don't even know these people. Why do I need to know about your story, right? I think what journalists need to do is actually tell people what matters and also which stories to pay attention to, right? Which ones are the real ones? And so I do think part of that is fact checking, right? Which is like, you're seeing an array of information out there about cats and dogs. Just so you know, the only thing that was ever eaten was a geese or whatever, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to get really postmodern with all this fact stuff. But I actually think, like, the kind of professional fact checkers were the ultimate, what Julia described as kind of a low-paid job for tech companies. They were literally entry-level jobs paid for by tech companies. I thought that was a terrible idea, to sort of pull the fact part out of day-to-day journalism and give it to very, very junior journalists working for Facebook. Just seems like an insane thing to do.
And only check it after the fact.
But yeah, and I do think more broadly, though, just to, like, again, like, I don't mean to keep doing this, but I do think, like, there are these narratives that we're all living in around this too. The words disinformation and misinformation carry this huge freight now, and I think part of our job is to punch holes in all of those narratives, basically.
I think we should just call it propaganda.
Or just, like, stick with things being true and false. I don't know. Because I worry you start talking about misinformation, you pretty soon get into arguments with people about whether misinformation can occasionally be true.
Or accidentally be true. The other thing about fact checking, as long as we're sharing rants,
Everybody hates the fact checkers. So sad.
They really, I mean, they work hard. The fact checkers' output mostly goes to people who already know whether it was a fact or not, right? It doesn't. If those fact checks could cross over to the people who really, really believe what they heard and then see the fact check and change their mind, that would be fascinating. But I don't see any evidence that's happening.
As I was researching this topic, I came across two Semafor articles that I really loved. And one of them is about AI running for office in Belarus, and the other was about AI and its ability to predict actual political outcomes. Could you?
Oh, I'm obsessed with this. Actually, I don't know the first story well enough to talk about it, but the second one I'm obsessed with.
Let me summarize the first story, and then you can obsess on the second. The first story was about how the political opposition in Belarus, which is the most authoritarian state in Europe, had mounted an AI candidate who, you know, was not a real person, but was actually saying a lot of the right things, and therefore was immune from political persecution. and actually was like appearing on ballots. Was not clear this person could win, and obviously all these elections are deeply controlled in Belarus. But the idea that like AI could be a tool of political dissent, I thought was just very intriguing.
That is really interesting.
But on
the second one, which I'm obsessed with, is this kid named
please.
Ned, I'm forgetting his last name, who just dropped out of Harvard and has built a system for polling in which it's a set of AI agents with specific demographic characteristics and matching those demographic characteristics to all the media that they have been trained on. And their claim is that you can poll these agents instead of polling people. And it's much cheaper. And you can just simulate society.
But evidently more.
I mean, I'm highly skeptical it works, but it's sort of a ping in the direction of like, oh, can you like simulate democracy, simulate society, and not actually have to do it? And I do think that's something you see in authoritarian countries in some ways, like, you know, using very sophisticated polling, but in some way the next step is eliminate the middleman of the citizen and just poll the bots.
Yeah, that's pretty striking. So, but you don't think the Nates are going to be put out of work anytime soon?
No, I don't know. I mean, these guys are pretty convincing. You should have them in for a panel. It's totally bizarre and
It's a great Silicon Valley marketing pitch that can raise a lot of money, whether they're right or not.
I also wanted, so while we're on the subject of kind of fact checking and public opinion, I noted with interest the AI democracy projects that you're involved with, Julia, which Julia's organization Proof News worked on with the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, about the quality of election information. So not misinformation for a moment, but just trying to find out election information or election-related information using these chatbots. And tell us a little bit about your findings.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of fact-checking, the people I'm really interested in fact-checking are the AI models themselves, right? So essentially what I did is actually downstairs right below us in the Brown Institute, I brought election officials from across the country and put them in front of computers where I had built software to like let them rate the models, all the five leading AI models' answers to common voter queries. Because my hypothesis here was that people are actually going to use AI for stupid things, like when do I have to register for, where's my polling booth, and just the way they use search. And the companies had actually all made pledges back in the beginning of this year, like we're going to make sure to provide quality information to voters, blah, 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 in the election. So I wanted to test that claim with election experts. And it was actually super interesting because it was journalists and AI experts and election officials together working on teams. And, you know, the TLDR is that the models were wrong, 51% of the time, and that's on average. And actually, some of them were wrong, like 75% of the time, and ChatGPT was only wrong 20% of the time, which is cool, I guess, for them. But it is also hilarious that, like, any one of us would lose our jobs if we were wrong any amount of that, anything near that amount of time. And this was after they had made these pledges, right? And we've been testing all year. We continue to test. We just published something last week about specific questions about voting with disabilities, like can I do curbside voting? Is there screen readers available? Once again, it was like 60% inaccurate. So they just do not answer basic questions on a topic of such incredible civic importance, and they have made repeated pledges to do it, this very minimal thing right. And by the way, it's very easy to get these things right because all you do is you say, I can't answer that question, go to trusted website, right? Like they don't have to have the answer. They just have to direct to a website. So it's very disappointing that these companies, and that's why I was saying that's what I worry about, the threat. These are companies that have made pledges to governments about their election. They haven't made pledges, by the way, about, Taylor Swift or whatever. They actually are, but on election stuff, they have made the pledges and they're not even meeting their minimum standard. So it makes me worry about what kind of commitment they have to integrity.
Which is fascinating because you don't need AI to figure out if there's curbside voting in a certain municipality. You could call the Secretary of State's office, right? Like, this is information that is findable without using AI.
But this is why this is so important, though, right? Because if you Google right now, voting with a disability in Ohio or whatever, and this is what the average person is going to do. They're not going to call the county elections board or even necessarily visit the state elections website. What they'll type in, they're going to get kind of a generative search result from Google, most likely. And you're basically saying that about half the time you will get incomplete or inaccurate information.
That's right. It was interesting. The election officials were very.
How did they react? Were they totally freaking out?
They were so outraged. You know, they had been in all these seminars. They said all these people were telling them how AI was going to be used. You know, they were about images and voice and all that, and they had never once thought about this text issue.
So focused on deep fakes.
Exactly. And they also sort of believed the hype. They were like, of course it's going to be good because like everyone has told us it's so good. And then they were like, wait a minute, it's saying these things. And so what was interesting is they actually rated 40% of the answers they actually rated as harmful, like actively harmful, would deter people from the polls. And it was interesting because we had these teams, and so some of the people who were not election officials, like the AI experts, were like, is that really that harmful? And the election officials were like, no, you don't understand. Like, any little bit of friction that you put into this process, like it was a bipartisan group. Like, they were like, we are so committed to making sure there's no friction here. And anything that you add that is misinformation along that way that deters someone is actively harmful.
So, I mean, I think this is I want to stay on this for a moment because I think it's such an interesting thread of discussion. I mean, we've all been to discussions and workshops, you know, where the terrifying nature of deepfakes has been explored at depth. I remember listening in particular to how, you know, you can get only small bits of, you know, remember the original Obama video that I think it was MIT, they, you know, had thousands of hours of Obama footage to construct a fake video, and now apparently you, with like half an hour of someone's video and audio, you can begin to. So I feel all the fears were directed against deep fakery, but like, is the broad direction of the public toward crappy, inaccurate, half-assed information in fact the greater threat?
I mean, I think that it is the banality of evil, right? Like, it is sort of this idea that just the very simple thing that you think you could trust something that calls itself artificial intelligence to provide you, which is just a simple answer to a question, is actually more likely how, like, an average person is going to encounter AI. And the thing that we don't know is the companies do not release any information about what kind of questions are being asked. So I'm hypothesizing that people ask these questions to AI. Certainly, anecdotally, I talk to people who say, yes, I've asked an AI for information about voting or whatever. But we don't know for sure how broadly that is. And I think that's actually something really important that we do need to know.
And these days, if you ask Google something, you don't necessarily know that you're asking for AI-generated results, even though it'll show you that there. Like the line between asking AI for something, like using ChatGPT, versus asking Google for something is completely gone, right?
Yeah, it's totally changed since when I did the testing in January, right? At that point, it maybe was a little bit remote, like you would go to AI, but now it's like it's embedded in everything. You're in WhatsApp, you're suddenly talking to AI. You're in your Google Doc, you're talking to AI. You're like, everywhere you go, AI is stalking you.
Yeah, I feel like I'm an aging Google user who still just wants the links. I just share the links. Okay, that's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about regulation for a moment. Congress has not done much, shocker, but a lot of the states, and surprisingly, in researching this, I was surprised to discover Texas was one of the first, have taken steps to ban.
Shouldn't you have known that?
I know, I should. I think we did some articles on it. But we, you know, to take steps to either prohibit or restrict the production of AI-generated election information, or at the very least to disclose the use of AI. And Neil, I want to start with you. You know, California has probably been the most out front with this. What is it trying to do, and how's that going?
Yeah, we are operating under the theory that this is a really important story coming out of California because the technology is made there, the people are there, and the regulation will come from there. And people in the California state legislature said they've been told by people in the national legislature, we're waiting to see what you do, right? And they're directly in touch with people in Brussels who are leading on this too. I mean, that's where a lot of the influence is coming from. And so there's a ton of bills in the California legislature this particular session. Out of 2,000 plus bills, several dozen had to do with AI. There's a couple that have already been signed. There's a couple of big ones waiting for the governor's signature. He has, I think, 5 days left to review 600 bills and decide how much, which ones he's going to sign. The one that maybe is most relevant to this was signed maybe a week ago, and it specifically is about having to identify something created by AI, but inside the metadata, not for public view. In other words, making it detectable by technology, by machines, by people who know what they're looking for, having the sort of the inside fingerprint that says this was made by AI. So that in theory, if you make some deepfake thing, somebody can go in and figure out that it was made by AI, and then making tools available to test it. So not what I think we'd all like, which is a giant flashing red thing at the start of it that says this was made by AI, but giving you, if you're skeptical, the ability to go in and look at it, which came from a legislator who's in a district that is heavily tech companies, and I think the approach that tech companies have taken is sort of this digital signature idea, right? We'll create technology so you can tag stuff. I don't know that the person watching YouTube and seeing one of these videos at home is going to say, I'm going to go use this tool from Adobe to go test this piece of video and see if it's actually coming from AI. So it seemed like it was an interesting step, but it doesn't address consumers directly. And then there's a bigger package of bills that are still not signed, the biggest of which is specifically to keep AI from doing harm, right? So to say, if you're creating generative AI, you have to go through this series of hoops around things like, can it be used to create can it be used to start a nuclear war? Can it be used to create a weapon? Can it be used for this, that, and the other? And almost like a testing regimen, right? Everything would have to go through this testing regimen. California is like Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and all the rest of it, right? This is a split. Silicon Valley loves it. Hates it, right? They don't want their stuff touched at all. Hollywood loves it because they're terrified about being replaced by AI. And so the governor, who has strong loyalties to both and all sorts of aspirations of his own, is like, this is one of those bills sitting there just annoying the crap out of him.
He looks
until the
more like a
deadline.
Hollywood star than a tech bro, some would argue.
Some would argue. So, yeah.
And so it sounds like that harm principle is similar to the EU regulatory approach.
In fact, it was directly, this is influenced by conversations between EU regulators, and the EU has an ambassador to San Francisco, an EU official who is the tech liaison to the US, who is based in San Francisco and works closely with California legislators. It's not a coincidence.
Not just the EU, actual multiple European nations have their own
Yes.
Silicon Valley
Yeah.
ambassadors.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
I mean, they are nation states, these companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like that's such a interesting, complicated push and pull. I did just randomly, because it's UN week, was interviewing a senior EU official who was saying, we got to get rid of this regulation because, like, we have all the regulation, the US has all the jobs, the entire industry, and like there is also a strain in Brussels of, like, what do we get out of being regulators for the world? Like, we haven't built anything. Every single company is in California.
So they're going to trick us into regulating, and then they're going to deregulate. And
I think that's their preferred route.
I love it.
Well, they are good at standing up for universal human
Mistral, the
human
French
values.
platform, is okay, but like, it's pretty striking.
So right now, the Federal Communications Commission recently announced that they are trying to take steps in this election cycle to require radio and TV broadcasters to disclose if the political ads were generated using
You're
AI.
talking about FEC, right?
FCC.
FCC.
But it's an interagency fight. FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, is saying they're raising doubts about whether the Federal Communications Commission has that authority. And of course, it's been very, very political. Some of the Republicans are saying this is all coming out now because the Democrats fear being left behind or left in the dust in this, AI arms race. Do you feel the regulators, Julia, can, most people who cover tech do not have much confidence in the alacrity and ability of regulators to keep up with the changing technologies. What's your take?
Well, I mean, at least in the United States, the federal government does absolutely nothing, right? So, like, that it's not just an opinion, it's just a fact that Congress has chosen to do pretty much no tech regulation. And I think, and that's true, and not much other regulation either. But I think that when you look at the thing I worry about with these bills, like, there are a lot of states, as you said, who have passed laws against deepfakes or AI-generated misinformation. But if you look at the history of laws like that, they are most often weaponized against dissidents and journalists. Like, so laws about the veracity of information tend to have an adverse effect. It just historically that's been true, and I do worry about that class of laws. The thing I'm more optimistic about is Section 230 exceptions. So Section 230 is is basically this broad immunity that Congress granted to the tech companies that said they're not liable for third-party content on their platforms. And so that basically means I'm immune from prosecution. If I write on like my Facebook page, like Sewell Chan is a pedophile, whatever, they don't want to have to deal with the defamation suit, right? Like they want it to be between the two of us. And that was sort of a reasonable accommodation at that time, but it has been stretched beyond comprehension to cover basically all their sort of gatekeeping and platforming and amplification of all sorts of lies and misinformation. And so one thing I love about AI is that they're creating the information. Like they're fighting in court right now to say with New York Times and other copyright suits that they didn't steal it from these people, that it's fair use. So then if that's true, I believe that they have to own the fact that they created that information, and then they should be liable, and they should not be immune from prosecution under Section 230. And so I think there's it's early days, but I actually think there's some real opportunity that these companies, if they want to be in the speech business, which we are in, and I'll tell you what the speech business is, it's a law business. You need a bunch of freaking lawyers to fight all your battles for you. That's what distinguishes us from other people who are speaking. And so I would like to see them have to defend their speech because they're creating products that spew out lies.
So for 30 years, the companies have been saying we're publishers, not platforms. And you're saying that the contradictions of that approach are now...
Yeah. I think and there's very little inkling of this. There's just the most recent case that gives me hope is I think it's the Third Circuit TikTok case. So basically, TikTok's algorithm amplified this blackout challenge. An 11-year-old girl died because she did this challenge, and this is the first time we've seen a court saying Section 230 does not apply when your algorithm was amplifying something. And just to be clear, algorithms are AI too, right? That's still AI. They're making a choice to promote something, and that's an automated decision. And so I'm just happy to see that because I have been wanting for a long time for there to be a distinction between what the companies do themselves and the third-party speech that is protected.
So in your example, you're putting on a defamatory comment about me is one thing, but the tech companies' algorithms, which are unaccountable, amplifying those comments would be quite another.
If they give everybody a suggested thing, like read all the bad things about Sewell Chan, that's where they should be held accountable.
Right, very interesting. Did you want to weigh in? No. We're going to move to questions very soon. I want to go back a little bit to the question of kind of campaigns. There was an interesting article about how so far the campaigns have not bought the many tech tools that have been offered to them by all these AI companies, and part of it is that they are fearful that, and say it was very interesting, some of them said, we might buy your tools, but only on the condition that you never disclose that we've done so. I don't know how much that could be hidden in the disclosure reports. But are you a little bit surprised that the deepfakery hasn't been used in this election more? I feel
Trump early on did one with some kind of AI-generated image that got a lot of backlash with it. It felt to me almost deliberate to get some attention, like it was a bit of a stunt. But yeah, but I think the thing is, you ultimately you want to be a story about why you're going to reduce immigration or reduce the price of whatever, not a story about how you're lying with AI. And so I think
the payoff was
yeah. Although I do think there's also, just adding to how complicated this is. I don't know if you followed this mess with Adobe, but Adobe Photoshop now has all these AI tools that allow you to, if you work with images, it's pretty amazing. And they're an evolution of digital editing tools that people were using to make somebody look a little better lit, or just look a little better, or clear out the background. But now, if you use certain of those tools, or at least for a while, you were getting that made with AI metadata. And then Facebook was popping up, this is an AI image, but no, this is an image of me with my kids on the beach, and I just fixed the lighting. And so, and I do think that the blending is going to be so total, every platform, every photo app, every phone. Google very heavily markets this feature. I'm sure you've seen the ads where one of the people in your group of friends has their eyes closed and they'll open them for you. So should that pop up as warning AI generated? That's not what we're going for. So I do think that blending is really tricky.
really.
And I do want to add just a note about the watermarking that you were talking about, that the tech companies there's a lot of people selling this idea that we can watermark or identify AI images, and that's going to be able to trace the provenance. But like, just to be clear, like the evidence from research is so far that does not work, and that is easy to circumvent. And so I think right now it's a silver bullet that's being offered in the future, and I'm skeptical of those.
And you can just screenshot the image and it loses
Yes.
the metadata. I mean, yeah.
What if you shoot in RAW? Is that chain of custody still valid?
I mean, you can build a chain of custody, but it's easy to circumvent, right, by screenshotting. And like, there's just so many ways that you can.
Although there's a
destroy
great
it.
blockchain startup that's going to fix this.
Are you collecting investment for it? Here? But even if the watermarking works to some degree, you can go back and figure it out. Somehow they make it bulletproof. Most consumers consuming this information with their eyes and ears are not going to be looking for the watermark or checking it or even thinking about it, right? So even if you can trace the history, that doesn't solve the problem of it being out there and available to a lot of people.
I mean, I sort of hate the media literacy discourse because it is sort of a blame the consumer. I can sort of, maybe I'm channeling Julia a little bit, like it is sort of a blame the consumer, it's not our fault, posture. But also, this stuff is moving so fast. There are open source models all over the place. Like, at some level, we are having to move into a world where people approach information and images and video and audio differently.
Yeah. I'd love to open it up for questions, and just to be a little bit provocative, I'd love to give the first question. I'll give the first. Margaret will get the second question. I'd love to give Alan Miller the first question, if that's not too much of a provocation. Alan, of course, runs the News Literacy Project.
No offense intended.
Well, it's hard for me not to pick up on Ben's comment. I mean, given the challenges that you've been talking about, we've been talking about today. Excuse me.
Put it closer to your mouth.
Okay. If we don't have, I know it's a question, not a statement, but I'll get to a question. But a public in general that's able to be more skeptical, to ask the right questions about what they're consuming. Is it news? Is it opinion? Is it misinformation, disinformation, propaganda? I mean, I don't know how they're going to be able to figure out what to believe and what to trust, and that there'll be a future for demand for quality journalism. So if the answer is not media literacy or news literacy, what is it in terms of what the public needs to navigate this incredibly complex information ecosystem?
Well, if you don't mind me jumping in, I'm making, in my new startup that I just launched this year, Proof News, I'm making a bet on two things on this exact issue. So I have an ingredients label on every investigation. It describes the ingredients of the investigation. So, and it's modeled on the scientific method. So it says, what is the hypothesis? What's your sample size? I'm totally willing to say, like, we talked to 3 people and that's it. I'm like, it doesn't have to be large, but we want to be honest about it. What are your findings and what are the limitations? So important to talk about the limitations. There's always limitations. And so one thing I'm trying to do with that is embed that in the story so that is, because I think right now a lot of the elements of trust are embedded at the institutional level, and people are not seeing stories at the institutional level. They're seeing it come across their feed in a separate way. And so I think the elements of trust that we have, like, oh, you should just trust it because it's Semafor or because it's CalMatters, I think people are seeing the news disaggregated from that. And the other thing that I'm betting on is online video. It's taking, everyone watches it. Nobody is reading the news anymore. The gatekeepers who we distribute text news through, which would be Facebook, X, and Google News, are all actively hostile to news content at the moment. YouTube and TikTok are increasingly where the audience is, and I think authenticity and trust are easier to convey when you see someone's face and you can talk through the limitations. And so I think there's a lot that journalists can do to improve our trustworthiness. We are generally, most of us, trustworthy, but we could do better at conveying that.
That's sorry.
Yeah.
I agree with that. I mean, I do think, but I guess I didn't mean to be dismissive of literacy. I think it's sort of the last resort here.
Yeah. There was a recent Shouts and Murmurs, the humor column in the New Yorker that, said the headline was "How We Got This Story," and it was a little bit satirical, but it was basically like, for this story we, sent 300 LinkedIn requests, we, spoke to 5 people on the street, called 311. It was actually quite funny, but is there a danger that we're giving, directed Julia, well, all of you, is there a danger that we're giving we're the only ones interested in the methodology?
That nobody wants that. I mean, but it is really interesting, though. I mean, I think that's a caricature. They're doing that because it's something real, and that Julia is doing. I mean, we're doing it in our way by trying to, in this almost sort of very deliberate, slightly pedantic way, say, here's the facts, here's the analysis or opinion. I mean, I do think that's responsive, actually, though, to consumers who feel totally overwhelmed and disoriented. And if the sort of like love affair of social media was about like, wow, I was stuck just reading one publication, now I have this huge range, I think the problem you're trying to solve now is really the reverse. I feel totally overwhelmed and disoriented. How do you distill and orient people?
Julie, I've got to ask this question. If in your ingredients, and I love that concept, we're going to write about it in CJR, in your ingredients list, what is the information equivalent to high fructose corn syrup?
Yes.
A sensationalizing lead.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. I think a really small sample size, right, is like we talked to two people and they were both my grandma, right? Like that would be high fructose corn syrup, or even worse, like I'm just screenshotting a tweet and writing 3 graphs.
That's it. We read a bunch of tweets.
Yeah, so that's what I would say, the really low.
The junk food of.
And honestly, the discipline of knowing that you're going to have to write an ingredients label actually does disincentivize that kind of reporting, because you're like, oh, I would have to write this down, right?
Yeah. How robust is this? Margaret, please.
Hello. I noticed that, you all came out of newspapers. I think that's fair. And you all work now or run news organizations that did not exist 10 years ago. CalMatters was...
We're 9.5.
Yeah,
9.5 years old.
I know,
so
I looked it up.
You're still good.
I looked it up. And I wonder if you could just, this isn't about the election, but if you could just each talk about, journalism and news organizations' sustainability vis-a-vis AI. How does the growth of AI, how does the proliferation of AI affect, for better or for worse, the sustainability of the kind of, fact-based, truthful journalism that we would like to see?
Neil, do you want to start there? And maybe you could also talk about the Democracy Data Project.
Sure. Thank you for the prompt. I have a little trouble with the word sustainability, because I think certainly in our organization, a lot of nonprofits, sustainability means you have enough people on staff who spend every day panicking about how to raise the money for next week or next month or next year, right? There's no kind of steady flow of money that's always going to keep us afloat. So for us, sustainability means just working constantly to raise that money. There are AI applications on the fundraising side, finding donors, reaching people, doing donor stewardship that actually could help us and are starting to help us, right? Just thinking about how we run the business of running our business. It is a business, even if between journalism and being nonprofit, you sort of forget that we're actually running a business, and it's really important that we think that we are. I do believe that harnessing AI properly makes our journalism better and makes us more sustainable in terms of creating an audience and engaging that audience, keeping that audience with us. The tool that Sewell mentioned, digital democracy, we took every possible imaginable piece of data you can think of about our state legislators, right? Where their money comes from, who gave them money, who's given them more money or less recently, how they voted, their voting records, their ratings from every organization out there that rates legislators, all the hearing transcripts and floor transcripts of the sessions, everything they've said, how successful they are at introducing bills and having them pass or fail. Every possible metric you could think of. We have dozens of them that we're pulling in constantly. We crunch all that data. We make it available to everybody on this tool called Digital Democracy. Reporters use it, lobbyists use it. A lot of people use it just to check out a candidate. And then we're applying AI to that to find story ideas. Right? There were once 150 journalists crawling all over the California state capitol. That's covering 120 legislators, by the way. By the time CalMatters started 9.5 years ago, that number was down in the single digits. We're never going to get back to that number. We have a lot more now, thanks to us and some other news organizations doing coverage there. But what the AI tools do is they look for anomalies in the data that maybe somebody would have seen when there were 150 journalists there. Senator such and such voted last week in a way that's really odd because it's against the interests of all the people who gave him money, or it's against the interests of the party or something else. And if you look at all the associations between every interest group, every donor to state legislators, and the way those legislators behave, you can pick up story ideas. They're not indictments. They're not things we would ever publish. They are the equivalent of a reporter scribbling something in the notebook. That's weird. Why'd they vote that way? I thought they felt this.
It's flagging things.
It's flagging stuff. And then those tips, we generate a PDF of a whole tip sheet. That tip goes to a reporter who can look at it and say, yeah, that's interesting. That's not interesting. I want to pursue it. I don't. Not just reporters at CalMatters, but reporters all over the state. And so we think using those tools to query the data, bring those ideas to journalists and let them pursue it is going to give us better stories, give local journalists and smaller newsrooms around the state better stories. And if we can raise all the money we want to and get it going, this will become national, starting with our friends at the Texas Tribune in 2025.
So, Julia, you've just started your second tech-focused newsroom startup. Has the AI revolution, or maybe it's overstated, have the AI developments influenced how you've designed Proof News?
Well, I mean, I think that they informed my thinking about this, focusing so heavily on embedding the elements of trust in the content itself, right? And so it definitely informed my approach to how Proof would operate and distribute its content. But I don't use AI. I've tried to do headlines, captions. It sucks at those. It's like it's like, and if you start with a bad version and then try to like iterate off of it, you actually just start in a bad place. So I find it not that useful. But AI is also this extremely broad term that we use for everything. And the reality is that AI is also a bunch of statistical techniques that I've always used in my data analysis, statistical regressions and stuff. So I'm always going to use those. They just recently became rebranded as AI.
Yeah, I guess I think like it's overhyped in both directions basically, but there's lots of cool tools, and I do think one of the reasons that these guys like to talk about how the killer robots are going to come destroy you is because in fact there's going to be sort of real medium-sized economic dislocation. Like in my newsroom, you're starting up a newsroom now, you don't hire copy editors, and nobody thinks like Grammarly is going to be patrolling street corners gunning people down, but that's like but that's an AI-enabled tool that eliminated a set of very specific jobs in newsrooms, and I think in general it, and whether you can see huge productivity gains as a threat to jobs or as a cool way to make your journalism more efficient probably depends if you're management or labor. I'm management. So like the fact that we have a partnership with Microsoft to do around a tool that one of my young reporters built that basically if like, I don't know, I'm trying to think what the news today is. There's peace talks in Gaza. Like what's the reaction in the Japanese, Korean, and Chinese press? Like you could spend a lot of time trying to find that, or you could do a search on Bing and structure it a certain way, and you can actually get that in real time. Of course, we also are not going to like publish the AI transcripts, although machine translation, another thing that people don't call AI, but is just one of the absolute marvels of the age, and where it was 5 years ago, Google Translate was a punchline, and 2 years ago it was like okay, but still pretty unreliable between major languages. It's now like unbelievably reliable and most measures better than human translation. And so like that's a huge shift for journalism. I mean, that's incredibly valuable and has all sorts of ramifications and is really interesting.
And not just language translation, by the way. 28% of people in California are at a 5th grade reading level or lower. So we're testing out things like, can you rewrite stories and recast stories in different ways, versions you can put in schools and libraries, like using these tools to have the important work we do reach more
literally
people.
The plain English.
Yeah, 25% of journalists are like 5th grade level, and like now they don't, they're great reporters but not great writers. Somebody can bang up their copy. It's great.
Behavior. Or
it's like that is another function though, right? Like the whole like get me rewrite. I mean, that's Claude.
Well, Ben, sometimes you get some free copy editing from me in the form of
after the fact.
Okay, yes, please.
We would have so many typos if we were not running these things regularly through these.
I think I said it wasn't for Sewell.
This is super compelling and I think really timely. I just want to circle back to something that, Sewell, you opened up with about the deep fake of Vice President Harris. And I'm curious about insights that don't center the typical product, or the typical cool breakthroughs or unhinged reverses that we can experience. Targeting Vice President Harris in very deeply concerning racist ways that a person that is dominant caste supremacy culture, dominant caste wouldn't feel the squeeze. So you can have the option to say, oh, it's just politics. It's a killer bee to people that that reaches. It's a system. So it's not just a comment that goes. So when I look at your title here, I'm homing in on this word fairness, and I'm interpreting that as justice, or what is just. So I wouldn't mind some insights as to the deeply concerning ways that someone who is a woman and also is of a different lived experience than the typical person running for candidacy would.
Well, it's a great question, and although this topic we could have hours on this, it's a great question. Thank you, and I want to just add to that, if I may, that a lot of this misinformation that's being created or generated is, of course, targeting less resourced communities. I don't call them low information communities, but it might be low quality information due to the news desert problem. So I think you raise a really profound, important.
And there's one of those bills, and two of those bills in California actually were around blocking the usage of AI tools in ways that would cause discriminatory behavior. So in redlining mortgages, right, or in discriminating against people in healthcare, things like that. There's so much of that going on anyway, and the idea that you can apply AI to it to accelerate those forms of unfairness. A couple of those laws, at least, are trying to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, she's on one hand one of the most powerful people in the world and has far more resources to battle ugly political battles than anybody else. And I think pre-AI, there were going to be disgusting racist and sexist attacks on her. There was no way around that. I do think there are a lot of both political candidates at kind of more local and low levels who don't have, $500-600 billion at their disposal to fight back, where you're going to see this stuff really play out intensely. I mean, the one place there's been actual regulation, which I think kind of reflects this realization, which we haven't talked about, is deepfake porn. That is literally the only place anybody's regulated, where it's just the sort of power and victimization there is so obvious.
I was just going to say that these companies, one of the most heavily harmful things that happens with AI, right, is non-consensual sexual imagery. And the companies have been incredibly slow to address this. And I've been covering tech, I don't even know how long, decades. And that's has always been true. Even when they weren't creating the tools to create the images, they were allowing them to be distributed. And I don't think it's also a coincidence that these are a bunch of companies run by men where women are not really up in the higher ranks. You saw Mira Marathi just step down today. That was the only woman at top of OpenAI, right? So it's clearly not an environment where women thrive, and it's also weird that their product is really used to, easily abused to weaponize against women.
Great question, thank you. Two more questions. We'll start in the back. And actually, why don't we do 3 quick questions, and then we'll have the panelists answer. So
answer the question of our choice, though.
Exactly, you can choose what you have.
Starting with me. I wonder about the talent pipeline for journalism with some of this. We talked about how, when the local press kind of disappeared, that lost a way for young reporters to cut their teeth locally and then step up nationally. And I wonder if AI, by taking away some of that sort of grunt work of transcription and research and all that stuff that's what I certainly did to get into the industry. If AI takes that away, do you worry about talent moving into journalism from those lower levels?
Can I?
Okay, well, Stuart, we'll have 2 more after this, and then we're done. Yep.
Just real quick, I think that's already happened. The entry-level job, we have a ton of kids who want to do journalism right now. The jobs they're getting now are not fact-checking and transcribing and being a clerk in the newsroom, right? They're the only reporter covering City Hall in that town.
We
I
throw
think
major beats at them, right?
Yeah, I would just say the other huge factor there is this kind of like shift toward a talent business in the print, in what used to be print, in which, like TV, I mean, I think this is, for better or for worse, often create very toxic TV cultures, but where the sort of energy and the value are centered on one person whose face is attached to it, and you're a producer for them in some sense. That's a very different environment, much less egalitarian.
Yes, in the blue blazer, and then we had one more at that.
Yeah, I'll try and keep this short because I know we don't have much time. I was wondering, given what you guys have been talking about, what we've learned about fact-checking in the last few years, and now that obviously AI is going to exacerbate those, do you think news organizations are doing a good job? Just to give one example, at the debate, obviously there was the cats and dogs claim, and that got a lot of heat over the next few days. Do you think that creates an environment where we're just kind of going back and forth on specific fact checks, and now there's way more people who know about that one fact check than know that what Donald Trump's immigration policy is versus Kamala's? Or in the early days of the Israel-Gaza war, like specific fact checks like got a lot of heat of like, did this airstrike happen exactly this way? Did this happen exactly this way? Instead of kind of a broader context for any of those.
So the fact check, the focus on the fact checking might lose some of the context.
Right, we're like hyper focused on, is this thing right? And now, yeah.
I agree with that critique, but don't have a lot to add.
Okay. And a final question. There was yes.
Given the fact that these, basically AI is amplifying fake news, but it's also amplifying it in an environment where people they have a confirmation bias for the information that agrees with their point of view or, their particular perspective in the world. So what should media companies be doing about that?
About human nature? No, I think that's it's a really good question. I do think like there are two things you can do. You can feed it, or you can try to resist that pull. An AI obviously is like a machine for, in some sense, just giving you the thing you want. And I think in politics in particular, there's always this question of like, are these facts? Like, were people believing crazy things Donald Trump says about, or is it a sort of different kind of expression? I do think in particularly political journalism, there's always this pull to write the story that will kind of generate the heat because it confirms people's biases, and how you navigate that is really important.
Ben Smith, Julie Angwin, Neil Chase, thank you so much for your insights.
And I'd like to add thank you, Sewell Chan, as well for that.